Montagu Chelmsford Reform, 1919. Montagu Chelmsford reforms the British once again resorted to the policy of carrot and stick. As on one hand they introduced Montagu Chelmsford reforms and on the other hand they brought in laws such as the Rowlatt Act. To implement the Montagu Statement of August 1917, the government announced the constitutional reforms in July 1918, known as the Montagu-Chelmsford or Montfort reforms. Montagu was the Secretary of the State and the Chelmsford was the Viceroy. The reforms took the shape of Government of India Act of 1919. Features of the Montfort reforms. Introduction of diarchy. Diarchy was introduced for the executive at the provincial level. Diarchy meant that there was a rule of two, such as executive councillors and popular ministers. The subjects were divided into two lists: reserve list, transfer list. Reserve list included subjects such as the law and order, finance, law, land, revenue, irrigation, etc., and to be administered by the governor through his executive council of bureaucrats. Transfer lists included subjects such as education, health, local government, industry, agriculture, excise, etc., to be administered by ministers nominated from among the elected members of the Legislative Council. Responsibility. The ministers were to be responsible to the legislature and had to resign if a no confidence motion was passed against them. The executive councillors, however, were not to be responsible to the legislature. At the provincial level, in case of failure of the constitutional machinery, the governor could take over the administration of the transferred subjects also. The Secretary of State for India and the Governor General could interfere in the reserved subjects, but for transferred subjects, the scope was restricted. Provincial legislature. The strength of the provincial legislative was further expanded, and 70% of the members were to be elected. Women were given the right to vote. The legislative councils could initiate legislation, however, the governor's assent was mandatory. The governor was also given the power to issue ordinances and veto over bills. The legislative councils were also given the power to reject the budget, but the governor could restore it if necessary. Central legislature. At the central level, however, no responsible government was envisaged. Its subjects were divided into two lists of for administration: central, provincial. Three of the eight members in the Viceroy's Executive Council were to be Indians. A bicameral legislature was introduced at the center. The lower house or central legislative assembly consisted of 145 members, 41 nominated and 104 elected, and the upper house or council of state consisted of 60 members, 26 were to be nominated and 34 elected. The council of the state had only male members with a tenure of 5 years, and the central legislative assembly had a tenure of 3 years. The legislatures were allowed to ask questions and supplementary questions, pass adjournment motions, and vote a part of the budget, though 75% of the budget was still not votable. Another important reform of the Act was the Secretary of State for India was now paid out of the British Exchequer. Drawbacks of the Montfort reforms. The franchise was very limited, with electorate extended to only about 1.5 million for the central regime. The population of India at the time was around 260 million. At the central level, the legislature had no control over the viceroy and his executive council. The diarchy at the provinces with the division of the subjects and parallel administration of two parts was irrational and hence unworkable. The ministers in the provincial government had no control over finances and over the bureaucrats. There was constant friction between the two. They were often overruled by the governor on any matter that the latter considered special. Congress responded to the reforms. The Congress convened a special session in August 1918 at Bombay, presided over by Hassan Imam. They passed a resolution declaring the reforms to be disappointing and unsatisfactory and demanded effective self-government. B.G. Tilak called the Montfort reforms as unworthy and disappointing sunless dawn, and he basically called them unworthy of England to offer and India to accept. According to Gandhi, the Montfort reforms were only a method of further draining India of her wealth and of prolonging her servitude.